afternoon, everyone. As I said, my name is Harold Mock. I'm the director of Georgia College's leadership programs. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this virtual forum with Jane Kim Coloseus, who is the executive director of her term. Before we begin, I must say that this virtual forum is being recorded. By participating in this program, you are consenting to being recorded. If you would prefer to view the recording instead of participating, please leave this meeting and email leadership.programs@gcsu.edu. Likewise, for the time being, please turn off your video and ensure that you are muted. That makes for a better experience for those who have limited bandwidth, and we will ask for you to rejoin us at the end. We're delighted to welcome our presenter, Jane Kim Coloseus, to Georgia College and to speak in our Inspire Forum on leadership. A student, Anaga Ramakrishnan, will introduce our distinguished guest momentarily, but allow me briefly to say a few words about our event. The Inspire Forum, the goal of that is to bring interesting and insightful presenters to Georgia College who our students might not otherwise get to spend time with or get to ask questions of. So I particularly encourage you this evening to think of good questions that you would like to ask our presenter. You can ask them either over video, or you can put them in the chat, and Ms. Copeland and I will help to moderate. In particular, think about connections that you may be able to make between courses that you're taking and what Ms. Coloseus shares with us this evening. Maybe things that you'd like for her to elaborate on, or things where you'd like to have some additional information. So please give that consideration. Likewise, please consider other topics that you would like for us to explore in future forums in the Inspire series. With that said, I would like to ask now Anaga Ramakrishnan to introduce our presenter. And after that, we will hear from Jane Kim Coloseus, Executive Director of her term, and have an opportunity to have some exchange with her and to ask questions. Anaga, if you would.
So Jane Kim Coloseus is a gender equality specialist who works in traditionally male-dominated industries, including the nuclear sector, national security, and politics. Currently, Jane is the executive director for her term, a Georgia-based initiative created to recruit progressive women to run for public office in the Georgia State Legislature. She is also the principal of EMSO Consulting LLC, where she works with small businesses and international organizations on diversity and inclusion, women's leadership, and empowerment. Jane serves on the Global Communication Committee for Women in Nuclear Global, a professional organization and global network for women working in the nuclear sector. Previously, Jane was on loan to the International Atomic Energy Agency by the United States government as a gender equality specialist. In that role, she increased the representation of women and earned the recognition of a top-performing technical UN organization on gender equality. Jane holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in Anthropology and History from the University of Virginia and a Master's of Science degree in Government Analytics from Johns Hopkins University. Please join me in welcoming Jane Kim Coloseus.
Thank you. Thank you, Anaga. Jane, if you would like to go ahead, please.
Yes. Well, hi. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for the warm introduction. I'm very happy to be here with Dr. Mock and Anaga. Thank you for the introduction, and Ashley as well. It's really, I believe it's a privilege to be speaking with everybody, and I hope that, hearing from me and my career and experiences will give you a lot of inspiration and motivation as you decide whatever it is that you are doing and what you like to do down the road. I've been asked to kind of give a little bit of a background about myself. Anaga did a great job in capturing most of the work that I have been involved with. But as she has said, I am a gender equality specialist working in traditionally male-dominated industries. Currently the executive director at Her Term, where we recruit progressive women to run for office. It is a small nonprofit. We work on very data-driven analyses to understand where are the most competitive districts in Georgia. And then we do a very deep dive into those districts to understand who are the local leaders who are in a position to run as a campaign, run as a candidate, and then win their seats. On my spare time, when I have any, I volunteer also for a professional association called Women in Nuclear Global, as Anaga had mentioned as well. I'm also the co-director for the Georgia chapter of Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security, which is a group that seeks to elevate women of color voices in government policy areas, especially related to peace, security, and conflict transformation. So that's a bit of a me. I would like to hand it back to Professor Mock.
Thank you, Jane. So we have a number of questions for you, partly based on the work you do specifically, and then maybe some more general ideas about leadership, leadership maybe specifically in Georgia, and citizen leadership for the public good. Our first question to you deals directly with the work that you do as a gender equality specialist. So much of your work has focused on women working in fields that are dominated by men. And my first question is, why is that work so important?
Great question. I believe the work is important because it really seeks to answer a fundamental question about what it means to live together and prosper together. Whose perspectives are missing, whose story is being told, and whose story isn't being told. What are the consequences when only a select group of individuals, based on a shared common trait, gets to decide what's important or not? So that's really the driving motivation behind it, to kind of answer this question. To kind of put it into a bit more of a context, for instance, car crashes. They say that women are like 75% likelier to be seriously injured in a car crash. Why is that? It's because when you have a crash, when people do a crash test, the crash test dummies are built on an average male's body. So if you are a woman, if you are pregnant, or if you have a certain disability, you are then more likely to be injured because your body hasn't been considered into that process. So whose perspectives are missing when we think about that? The COVID pandemic, women are disproportionately being harmfully affected by the impact of the coronavirus at the moment, especially women in the workforce, if we wanted to kind of go a little bit more narrow into a certain category. Why is that? A lot of times people say it's about caregiving issues. So then we think about, well, why don't we have a great policy or some sort of a social welfare program that helps families with young children, especially for caregiving? We don't have that. So the question is then, why is that? Whose perspective was missing? And who made that determination in terms of not having those policies in place? So these are kind of really the questions that really drives the idea and the motivation between why we focus so much on working in these fields that are traditionally dominated by male, because the systems and the cultures that are currently put in place really doesn't really represent the experiences, the life stories of a bigger group of people. So yes, the work of an equity specialist really to highlight that and try to bring changes. Hopefully, by bringing more diversity into the room and onto the table.
So I have kind of a follow-up question to that one, because you mentioned a few of these, but what specific challenges would you identify as a hamper to gender equality?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the specific challenge I would say is actually, this of wanting to hold on to the status quo, because we're really comfortable with the status quo. It's been perpetuated throughout our culture, through our society, in terms of, like if you have to, like the certain traditional profile of a political candidate or elected official, is quite well known. But also at the same time, it's what we are also brought up to believe in. So I think that is kind of the biggest challenge. I always say that change is scary, but it is the most common thing that happens to you every single second of your life. And so it's really about how do we change the status quo?
On that note, then, another follow-up. Some of the examples that you gave about caregiving during the pandemic, or even car crashes, those are not things that are intensely political issues necessarily.
No.
They're things that might, to most of us, just seem very practical. That is, they're not terribly partisan. And I just as an observation, I'm curious if you would agree, a lot of the work that actually you're describing, my assumption is not terribly partisan, but it is disruptive to the status quo. Is that a fair assessment, and how would you respond?
Well, the cases that the examples that I mentioned, as you said, are quite partisan. It's quite of a neutral territory, I would say, just to kind of, give an understanding of why does diversity and inclusion matter. It doesn't necessarily, it's not because one person or one party or one ideology is trying to, gain an upper hand, but just highlighting the fact that, when you don't have diverse representation, certain perspectives get left out. Now, if we could definitely go into more partisan issues, whether that's climate change, immigration, reproductive freedom, but really the conversations around those is really people trying to have a say and have a representation. I have something to say because of my lived experiences, because of my background, that I don't feel reflected in current legislations or current policies. And so that's where a lot of the divide comes in.
On that note, then, our next question to you is, so it occurs to me that you have two very specific challenges that you've likely confronted in your work and career. The first is the technical nature of what you do, and the second is what I was referring to, the political nature. First, taking the technical dimension, your master's degree is in government analytics, which is a fairly narrow and technical field. And you've spent much of your career in government service and with the IAEA, focusing on nuclear issues, another field that has a vast technical jargon and that very quickly excludes outsiders. Now you work in the world of politics, and a lot of people find that very intimidating. How is it possible then to build equity and representation and inclusion in fields that have such high barriers for entry? Or maybe put it another way, in fields that are so technical that they are inherently exclusive?
It's just such a great question. There's so many things we can talk about and unwrap, but I wanted to focus perhaps maybe on two aspects of it. The first is you've asked, these fields are considered, having such high barriers for entry. I dare say that's a myth. And the reason is because of this. Let me tell you a little bit about my story. So I have an undergrad degree in anthropology and history. And so with that degree, I got into the nuclear field, completely non-technical to a technical field. How did that work? Because when we think about nuclear, we think about, okay, fusion reaction, power plant operations, weapons, very kind of like you need to understand different graphs and Einstein, whatever. But, in order for those things to work, you actually need a lot of people that have project management skills. They could be lawyers, they could be administrators, human resources, IT professionals. There are so many, a diverse level of backgrounds that need to go and work together to make all of this happen. So I started off as kind of a liaison officer, which means that I was working with and reporting to different government entities, organizations, funders, think tanks. And one way that they all talk in a common language is by understanding, how is my money being spent? Where is progress being made? Show us the numbers. And so when I eventually went over to the United Nations working for the International Atomic Energy Agency, it was a similar story as well. I was responsible for working on their gender equality portfolio, and we needed to make changes. But in an international organization where there's like 150 plus nationalities presented, words sometimes don't get across the way that you intend it to be. So what do you use? You use numbers, you use data, you help them understand exactly what the picture is, where the gaps are, what the needs are. So because of that, during my tenure at the UN, I decided to do a master's program. So full-time working, part-time studying, it's hard. But that's what I decided to do because I felt like I needed to actually, have an additional layer of understanding, an additional layer of having, of being able to speak in a way that, that can be really understood. So that's how I got into, getting my Master of Science degrees in technical analysis. And I would say, that's probably one of the best things I have done as well, because now that I am in politics, when we are doing recruiting, we do a lot of data analysis in terms of, let's look at the state of Georgia, let's break it down to each district, each county. We're going to run the numbers about demographic data, voting trends, etc. And, because that will give us a concrete understanding of where we can really target our work. So, at the end of the day, what I'm trying to say is that technical is very important. There is a lot of way to define what a technical work is. Either that's a nuclear engineer or a data analyst. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it proved to be a common language where we could really talk about things in a way that perhaps just English cannot conclude. So that's one part. Sorry, that was a bit long. But the other thing that you had asked about was, how do you build kind of equity, representation, inclusion in these fields? All I have to say is that, you can make as much noise as you want on the outside, but you really can't drive change unless you are on the inside, in these supposedly mythical high barriers for entry fields. And really, get in the room and sit on the table and get people to talk about the issues.
Well, to add to that, I was going to take a question from someone that shared in the chat. What made you consider going into this field and really this kind of combination of these two?
You mean the field of gender equality and the combination of nuclear and politics? Which combination are we? Oh, okay, yeah. Well, quite honestly, I just fell into it. It wasn't that, when I was 10 years old, I opened my little journal and wrote down, this is what I want to be when I grow up, nuclear plus politics, and I want to make change where more people could be represented. No. I naturally fell into it. And I think, a lot of, I can also speak for a lot of colleagues as well, who kind of also naturally fell into the work that they are doing. So it's really okay if you don't have a concrete plan of what you want to do, and we'll work out. But really, when I graduated from my undergrad, I have always been wanting to work for the US government. But at that time, they had a hiring freeze because, recession, funding issues, that's US government for you. So I decided, okay, I want to just, perhaps take this time as an opportunity to perhaps travel and work abroad. So my family comes from South Korea ethnically, so I decided to go back and teach them English and do some translation work. And then I got connected via my network to work for a nuclear nonprofit that was doing a lot of work in South Korea because they were a big nuclear powerhouse in that region, which naturally led me to working for the International Atomic Energy Agency because I built my network. I've met people. I was really great at communicating with outreach and just working with partners. And they said, well, we actually really need somebody to work on gender equality. We know you don't have a background in that, but are you interested in it? And I said, well, what's the problem and do you have a solution? It's like, this is a problem, but we don't have a solution. So I said, well, great. I'm great at implementing and coming up with solutions. So we'll work on that. So we took a very pragmatic approach, and that really kind of opened up a lot in terms of, wow, this issue is really prominent in actually industries across every industry. So what I realized was that being able to work on gender equality issues on organizational development is actually quite a transferable skill from one industry to another. So that's how I got to work into, I worked with international security organizations, think tanks, also nonprofits working on foreign policy, and now also in politics as well, because there are common traits and transferable knowledge that you can use about a certain topic.
What I hear you saying, Jane, is that maybe to the students on this in this conversation, it's okay if they don't know exactly what path they're going to take, right? So on that note, then, a lot of the folks who are in this conversation right now, who you're talking with, are college age, and I imagine we will see quite a few of them in the next decade or two to come enter public service, whether as elected officials or policymakers. What do they need to know and do now in order to be more effective later? Because where you stand in your position, you can sort of see both sides of that. How can maybe some of the students you're talking with this afternoon best position themselves for success in that environment in the years to come?
Yes, I love that question so much. Thank you for asking it. I would first say, learn as much about the issues that you really care about and just get involved. When we think about politics, it's actually really about organizing in a way. It's organizing supporters, organizing partners, making sure people can, be on your side so that you can, pass a bill that you want to. So I think, put the time and effort into really learning, what really motivates you, what do you want to care about, and, perhaps be vocal about. Follow what's happening in your current state. A lot of times, I think when we think about US politics, especially on newspapers and the media, it's all like really big picture items, at the federal level. But, I would have us start at the state level, maybe local level even, just follow what's happening in your neighborhood, in your district, in your county. Try to meet with elected officials. Normally, they like to meet people. So if you just reach out to them, email them, perhaps not now because they're busy with their session, which probably will end in March. But they're always happy to meet and talk. Again, when I said about a cause that you really care about, join a club, join an organization, perhaps start a nonprofit yourself. Why not? I think, being in these positions as an elected official or a political powerhouse, like what's really great is that, age doesn't matter as long as you kind of bring your passion, your time and effort into it. And I'm really stressing kind of this whole thing about, find a cause, or you may already have a cause and be passionate about, because what I personally want to see in folks in public service leadership positions are those with authenticity, whose words actually match their actions. They're not there just to say whatever I want to hear, but they're there to say, this is what I really care about, and this is what I will work on. And these issues, I may not care as much, but I'm willing to work on it because you've seen my track record when I'm passionate about this particular cause.
So I've got a question that's more specific to the work that you do with her term. You mentioned one, I guess, kind of factor or trait that you look for in folks is this level of authenticity. But what are some challenges that you face in identifying and then encouraging women to actually run for office?
Yes. So I think a couple things. First is the myth that women can't win. What I found out is that actually women are as effective as male candidates, if not even more, when it comes to the conversion in terms of their winning factor. It's just that we don't see it because women just don't run. And why don't they run? It's because they're just not really being asked to run for office. I would like to ask everybody here who, is a woman or identify as female, have you woken up one morning and suddenly thought to yourself, wow, today's a great day for me to run for office? I would say probably not. For the men in the room or who identify as men, have you thought about that? What did that come a bit more natural to you? So I think there are already kind of like built-in biases that we have towards ourselves, that already starts limiting our kind of interest or potential to run for office. And just because our current political process is really built for a privileged few, which is mostly like white or male candidates for success, it's particularly harder for women to run, especially if you're a woman of color or an underrepresented or a kind of non-traditional candidate. It's even harder because it's really not built for those folks. So there are already kind of like early inequities that you will face. So yeah, it is harder, but I always say, like, please consider a run for office, even starting from student president to any kind of organization you're involved with. It's really great.
As a follow-up to that, Jane, can you just tell us kind of nuts and bolts, what are some of the facts that we need to know about the state of Georgia? And connected to that, what do you actually do when you go to work in the morning? What does your job look like in terms of making these kind of big ideas a reality?
Yes, nuts and bolts about Georgia. I guess I will just kind of narrow that a little bit more in terms of women's representation and women in politics here in Georgia, because that's kind of what I do as my job. I would say the state of Georgia is perhaps one of the leaders in the Southeast region in terms of women's representation in politics. At our state level, which is the state legislature, so state house and state senate, they go to work at the state capitol in Atlanta. We call it the Gold Dome because it has a little gold dome on the top of the building. I would say about 30% of our representatives are women, mostly Democrats. However, having said that, when we think about in that body of our legislative representatives, there are leadership positions, and whether that's Speaker of the House or any other sorts, I would say not many women have served in leadership capacities, even though we make up a third of the legislative body. We talk about committees. Committees are basically kind of like smaller group meetings, or you talk about a very specific topic, whether that's transportation, appropriations, where money is being spent, etc. A lot of that is actually, we have about, I would say, close to 30 to 40 committees combined in the Senate and the House, and perhaps only 10 are chaired by women, if not even less. So even in those kind of leadership capacities in a smaller scale, women are still underrepresented. Just up until 2019, we only had one congresswoman representing Georgia at the US Capitol Hill. Well, now 2021, we have 4, but our congressional body, our delegation is 14. So it's not even half of the population is represented because 51% of the population is women in Georgia. And we have never had a woman governor. We have never had any woman, we never had a US Senate who was a woman who have been elected to the position. We've had 3 so far. They've all been appointed. So I think that really says a lot about kind of the ups and downs of the current state of Georgia in terms of women's representation. But I'm really hopeful that it will change and it will only get better. More so because you will also run for office one day. The second part of the question, I believe, was, what do I do at my day-to-day work? It's just really a lot of emails and meetings. It's mostly talking to people. So a lot of it is people who want to run for office, or me or my colleagues, reaching out to somebody to just kind of get their interest to see if they're interested in running for office. But it's also about partnership building, other organizations, whether that's in Georgia or somewhere in the nation. We talk to them to see how we can collaborate. We also have a big network of local and state allies in Georgia. So, we have like continuous conversations about how's it going, what's the issues, how can we help, how can we collaborate. So it's really all about building relationships and just talking to people. It can get exhausting, that's for sure.
If I can ask a brief follow-up on that, what you're describing to me sounds kind of intimidating. And I imagine it sounds that way to potential candidates, people you're interested in building relationships with, or for that matter, to the students who are on this call. We have a question in the chat from Emma Perry about money. And I imagine that's a big question that comes to mind when you talk to a potential candidate. There may be people who want to run for office or who want to do some of the things that you've described, organize, build relationships, and so forth, but can't afford to invest in a campaign themselves, or don't have the experience necessarily that, where they might ask somebody to make a gift or I should say a contribution. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because what you're describing to me sounds like it could be intimidating.
Yes, it is. And it's not really my intention to intimidate, but to just give you like a really honest picture of the expectations. Yes, money is the hardest thing. Even for seasoned candidates and elected officials who continuously have to raise money for their campaigns, it is not an easy task. It is probably the number one thing that everybody struggles with it, and everybody feels really uncomfortable doing it. So you are not alone in thinking that. I can tell you, like, for instance, Joe Biden will already be thinking about like, oh, I have to raise money again, how intimidating. Having said that, there are strategies and tools and resources that people can use to make it a little bit easier. Sometimes when it's hard, for instance, to ask people for money, we always have this great thing called a fundraiser who you can hire, who's an expert in doing it. But a lot of the bulk of the work also comes from you as well as a candidate, because people want to hear from you. And I think it is the greatest exercise in terms of putting yourself out there in a very vulnerable position, and being able to overcome it. Because if you can do that, there's nothing else you cannot do. Whether that's fighting with your opponents, or having a conversation, a debate, or standing up for yourself and your constituents, it's a great practice ground for yourself.
So I want to take another question from the chat. Lily asked, how do you address the issue of lack of intersectionality in gender equality focused political discussions? Like you said earlier, it's harder for women of color to get jobs and positions than it is for white women. How often, or even how is intersectionality incorporated in that discourse?
Yeah, it's at least when we talk to potential candidates, it is something that we talk about, especially more in detail if you are a person of color or a person who identifies, non-white and etc. So there is no solution for this at the moment. It's just that we must acknowledge the current reality and just try to prepare you the most, because you will have to work even harder. And there are more biases against you than perhaps a more traditional candidate. So at least we try to lay out the expectations, knowing that there's really not a one fits all, helps all solution. And one thing that we also try to emphasize, that I also try to emphasize, is that it may be hard for you today, but it will not be hard for instance, Lily 10 years later.
Yeah, I appreciate the forward thinking and future thinking of like the next generation of leaders too. I have a specific question that I was very interested in asking you. Could you speak more to the role of women in social movements and how that translates to policymaking and political life? Like thinking of the Ella Bakers and what we now see with Stacey Abrams with Fair Fight.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And it's actually it's also an area where I feel like I don't know as much. So I'm like also learning a lot and experimenting a lot as well. But, when we talk about social movements, let me take a step back as well. Let's look at the bigger picture. When it comes to bigger policies or legislations that impact communities, oftentimes anything that is very threatening to somebody, whether that's because they decided to build up a nuclear testing site next to a village, or they decided to dump waste in a town hall. I think all of those things have already a unequal kind of distribution of communities in terms of like income or education. And oftentimes in those communities, we have very strong women leaders, just kind of like, I don't have the research or the data of why, but it seems to me that, the most impacted communities are often led by women of color or communities of color. And so what's really important is that, if we want to kind of change these policies, we need to incorporate their voices and perspectives as well, because they have been most impacted and they have been trying to, make it better for their communities. So they perhaps know a little bit more about what works, what doesn't, what's the problem with these policies that have been made high up in the ivory tower without, much representation at the beneficiary level. So I think that's really key. And the nonprofit that I am now volunteering at, Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security, is exactly trying to address that as well. Any kind of big problem issues that we are facing that is threatening to us, whether that's human rights, climate change, even for instance in Michigan Flint with the water issue, we have to be able to understand how to incorporate communities of color and their experiences, because that's how we can make change.
Taking us back then to what you're describing, the kind of political nature of this, we're living in a rancorous political era, and many people, especially our students, I imagine, when you talk to them about anything having to do with politics or public discourse, they often see that world as tainted and don't want to have anything to do with it. But so far in our conversation, you've taken exactly the opposite approach. You're talking about this world as if it's something something sort of exciting to pursue. And I wonder, how do you confront those challenges when maybe people see the world of politics as somehow tainted by kind of bad actors? How do you confront that?
Yes, the world of politics is tainted by bad actors. It is tainted by money. There's truth to that. I'm not trying to, sweep that under the rug. But what I well, it's really hard because it's how should I say this? I think in terms of just kind of having that public discourse, which can be quite negative and quite threatening to a lot of people, is to really understand like two things. The first is that a lot of that discourse that is we are really impacted by and disillusioned by what we see on media, on TV and movies. There's a lot of dramatization, especially with movies and stuff. They want to make it very dramatic. So sometimes what you see on TV are like, why is that? That's not possible. And so that's why I've been trying to talk a little bit more about kind of focusing more on, what's happening in your community at the local and the state level as well. Because when you distill it into smaller pieces, what you actually realize is that every action we take today is actually a political action. You decide to stop at a red light, that's complying to the laws that will keep everybody safe, traffic laws. That's a political decision that you are making. Do you or your parents hate your HOA, for instance? That is a political discourse as well, because there were political mechanisms put in place for real estate property issues. Do you wish there were more sidewalks where you can go out for a run, especially during this pandemic? You got to keep that weight down, right? That is also a political decision as well. So I think when you kind of distill it down to smaller pieces, to kind of look at the micro level in terms of what is happening that's impacting me, what is happening that is impacting my neighbor, and how can we make it better? I think that is kind of like where I want to be at when we come to political discourse as a nation, as neighbors, and as fellow citizens. But also be wary that, yes, of course, it has been tainted because it's a very unregulated area, and a lot of people with influence are able to make changes that does not uphold the Constitution, but rather the personal interest of a select few. So it's not all rainbows and daisies, but I think when we recognize that and try to be wary of it, we could make changes. It's a very hopeful message, I know.
So on that note, you just mentioned the word citizenship. I feel we often don't talk about what that word really means. So what would you hope for your audience today, which is, again, mostly college students? What would you hope they will understand about citizenship?
Having lived and worked abroad for a long time, citizenship feels different to me. And the reason is because for me, and what I would love for, hopefully, our audience today can also recognize as well, is that citizenship is really about responsibility. It's very easy for us to not think much about it because it's granted to us as, Americans, and it can't be taken away. So, you're just kind of like, oh, well, I have it. It's great. Let's just live with it. But it's actually, there's a lot of responsibility that goes to it. Not just me, but the government as well. I pay my taxes. They provide a service. You go abroad, and then you're an American in a foreign country. You're basically an American ambassador to those citizens, It's citizenship, I believe, is also not a pie with limited number of slices that everybody had to kind of hold on to my slice and not share, but it's actually something that can be grown in size and shared in a way that helps everybody and doesn't make anybody lose out on anything. And I think it is a great responsibility and something that, as I have worked and lived abroad and, having multiple, having a lot of colleagues with different nationalities, it makes me very aware of what I have, what I don't have, and what I can do to, make sure that, our citizenship in the world, is considered a great thing, and it will be considered a great thing in the future as well.
We have a question in the chat from Anaga, and I'd like to, Anaga, if you would, go ahead and ask your question.
My question is, how does the current environment of the COVID-19 pandemic affect your job in encouraging women to run for office? Have you found it to be easier to convince women to run as problems of inequality have become magnified, or has it been harder due to the circumstances?
Um, I would say it has been easier and harder. And yes, it's one of those crazy answers. And the reason is because it's easier to convince somebody to run for office because, the impact of the pandemic and it has on your daily life, whether that's your work, um, healthcare, childcare, helping out family. The impact has been so great, and especially at the Georgia state level, there hasn't really been a lot of remedies that has been put out by the state government. So a lot of women are like, well, we've elected them to do the job, but they're not doing it. So I'm going to go and take their job. Or I know somebody who can do a better job. They're much more capable. So the motivation to run for office, inspired by the pandemic and the current government's inability to really provide a concrete solution to safeguard the citizens is something that is a is a great talking point for us as well. But it is also especially that much harder for women to run for office because now, when I talked a little bit about the COVID pandemic, the harmful effect of the COVID pandemic, especially to women and working mothers, that has really kind of exasperated all of the kind of time and energy that women could have otherwise put into running for office. So even if we had somebody who is especially talented and feel like they will be a great choice, a lot of their answers will be like, right now is not a good time because I have children at home, or I have a sick elderly at home that I have to take care of, and I'm working from home, or I have to run 2 jobs just to like pay my bills. So running for office on top of that in itself becomes like such a burden. So it is, yeah, it is. They are both. That's the yes and no, basically, when it comes to running for office during the pandemic.
Jane, with answers like that, you could be a college professor.
Oh.
Monica, thank you for that good question. And I would encourage any of you who have questions for our presenter, please share them in the chat. We have about 10 more minutes that we can ask those questions. But I will ask the next one. Jane, can public service still be a noble profession?
I hope this is not a trick question. Just kidding. I've always believed it to be a noble profession. And public service isn't just somebody becoming an elected official and putting their hand on the Bible to swear the oath. Public service is something that you can always do, like, anytime. Picking up trash at the park, that's not your trash, and putting in a trash can. That's a form of public service. Talking to others about something you care about, and having people also care about it. That's also public service too. For me, the definition of public service is actions and intentions that you do to benefit others, to leave whatever you're doing a better place. The profession of public service is taking that one step further and trying to codify such actions and intentions in a way that does really help people. So yes, I do believe that it is a noble profession. It gets a lot of crap from a lot of people, yes. And is it easy? Definitely not. There are days where I feel like, oh, I have to find a new job. I cannot be in politics just because I cannot handle the people. But at the end of the day, we're here to uphold the Constitution. We're here to, try to make an impact and change that could really benefit a lot of people, not just a select few or not a single person. So I would say it is a service that is not recognized, and but if this is something that really drives your motivation, I think it is a great profession to be in.
I have a question that I wanted to get to earlier from Christina, It does sound like your views on leadership are deeply tied to servanthood and public service. How would you say that your leadership style or your beliefs on leadership have changed over the years through your work?
Yeah, great question. It's changed dramatically. So in the beginning, when I was very green and young, working as a junior, intern, whatever, my view of leadership was that, wow, somebody at the top of the building, who's an expert in whatever field that is, and makes big decisions. Basically, the number one alpha who puts their signature on the final document. As I have, evolved and worked in different professions with different people, my view of leadership definitely have changed. Leadership is not just at the top of the level. It is something that permeates through every single level, including even you today here. It is not about putting your signature on the final document, but it's really about managing difficult conversations and managing relationships with people, and really trying to build a consensus. So yeah, I believe that.
In a similar note to Ashley's and to Christina's question about your views, I wonder if you'll share with us what is maybe one of the best books or something that sort of shaped your outlook on the world, your worldview, your Weltanschauung. What is something that has really impacted you or motivates the way you think?
That's such a tough question. But I would say it is actually a science fiction called Dune by Frank Herbert. Because it's like politics, religion, science, it's got atomic weapons, it's got climate change, it's got ecology. I mean, it's just such a great book. I read it like almost every summer. That's the one book I read over and over ever since I was a teenager. So like a long time ago. And I think it did kind of really help a lot in terms of how I view, especially like relationships, conversations, people coming from very different perspectives, because everybody's needs are very different. And how does that really kind of, create conflict, create peace? For me, I would say that's my best book. I can see Ashley like nodding very, very rigorously.
Just started reading it, so it's on my nightstand. I'm just barely a few pages in, and already enjoying it too. So yeah, I really appreciate that book, and encouraging for me to continue reading it. So we do have another question from our audience. Emma Perry is asking, who are the leaders that you look up to most and why?
Oh, great question. Let me think. Well, I can name a few, but for me, the leaders are those who've kind of made an impact in my personal life as well, but who are also, in their professional capacity, doing a lot of great things. So one of those persons would be Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins. She used to be under the Obama administration. She was appointed as the ambassador for arms control. And then now she's nominated to be the Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Affairs. But the reason is because, she was really, how should I say it, saw my potential and just, was very like open and approachable and friendly, even for somebody who's like in her position, being like really on the top level at the government, just to kind of take the time to just really open herself up and mentor and have a conversation. So it's really inspiring and such a role model. And I think I was very lucky to kind of like be in that relationship with her. My former boss also, who used to be the Deputy Director General at the IAEA, so that's kind of like the number 2 position at that UN agency, is also a great role model and inspiration for me as well, because she was the one who hired me on, and really, I had a very open conversation with her about like, this job description, these things I might not be able to fulfill because quite honestly, I'm just not there yet. And she said, don't worry, you have potential and you will have the right tools and resources to get there. So, you know, I think that was such kind of, I guess, life altering meetings, because it showed that you don't need to be like, in your first job, you don't need to have like 3 to 5 years of experience and be able to have like 5 publications under your name just to get the job, but that there are actually people who look for your potential and what you could potentially bring as you grow into your career to the table. And I think that kind of approach is still very much needed. I think a lot of times in the hiring process that is lost, but it makes you more committed and motivated to be the best that you can be.
I'd like to ask the last question, really by turning it back around to you, Jane. Is there anything else that you would like to share with our audience this afternoon? And maybe another way of thinking about that is if you could go back and talk to your 18 or 20-year-old self at the University of Virginia, what would you tell your college age self?
Well, that time I felt like I was, now compared to myself now, I was probably a lost sheep by then. But I think, one thing that I would love to kind of, say is that it's okay to feel the way you are feeling, whether that's, not feeling like you're successful enough, or or feeling like you probably don't have like a concrete path that you want to go into. If you feel like you're just dabbling in everything but not really understanding like where you feel most passionate about, I would say that's okay, because as you continue to have more experiences and meet new people, there will always be things that you never knew existed that you could do. So I would say don't limit yourself to a particular lane. It's okay to switch back and forth between different lanes and different categories of whatever you're interested in, because ultimately at the end of the day, you have to be very happy with your choices. Choices you made freely of your own choice, rather than peer pressure or just pressure in general from expectations. Hopefully that's helpful.
I think that's wonderful. I think that may be good things for all of us to hear, not just 18 or 20-year-olds. But well, Jane, I certainly want to thank you for your time and your insights and all that you've shared with us. And I would, maybe once the pandemic is over, I'd invite you to join us at Georgia College in person. I know that we have a lot of students who'd be very interested to meet you, and I imagine in the decade to come, we'll be seeing some of them in public service. Maybe we'll correct that imbalance you pointed to. But Jane, thank you so much for your time and your insights, and likewise to our guests, to our students. Thank you all for joining and for your excellent questions. And look forward to seeing you all, I hope, very soon. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. And I just want to say it's been a privilege and an honor to speak with everybody here. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn or Twitter, Clubhouse, whatever you're on. And I'm happy to just, just talk with anybody as well.
Thanks, and good night to everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.